Okay. Thanks a lot to everyone. Welcome everyone to attend this session. We'll have presentations of 4 very interesting research papers on land. The session broadly titled "The Broader Impact of Land Titling." I think these are 4 very interesting papers. We have 2 hours, and after this session, right after the outside, there's a cocktail reception. So I don't want to be for this session to be the barrier to the reception. So my main job, I see, is to keep the time, and we'll finish on time at 6 o'clock, so we can all enjoy the cocktail. So we have about 2 hours, so 4 papers for presentation. So we will, for each paper, we'll have about 30 minutes. And I think the presenters will present the paper 15 to 20 minutes, and then we'll have 10 to 15 minutes for questions, answers, and comments. Okay. With that, maybe I'll introduce our first speaker, Marco Fabbri from University of Bologna, Italy. The paper he is going to present is How Property Shapes Distributional Preferences.
Okay, thanks for the introduction, and thanks everybody for being here, for inviting me. It's a great conference. So I'm presenting a joint work today with Maria Bigoni, who is a colleague from University of Bologna. And I skipped the motivation regarding why land rights are important and why inequality is important, but let me start with the research question and say why we think we want to investigate, to test whether property right, or actually land rights organization could affect distributional preferences. And everybody in this room took class principle of economics. We know that preferences are like the Rocky Mountains, but we also know that it's not always the case. And there are some institutions, important institutions and institutional shocks that could affect preferences for distribution. And we know there are a bunch of examples in the literature, and we thought that the introduction of a different organization of land rights in certain communities can affect these distributional preferences. And to test this intuition, we combined randomized control trial intervention, randomized control trial reform that was implemented in Benin, in West Africa, with the support of Millennium Challenge Corporation by the Beninese government, and an a field experiment that we conducted piggybacking on this reform. So the context in which our study is developed is Benin and the Republic of Benin, and we are looking at the effect of a reform, of a land titling reform, or actually, I have to be more precise in this context, a land rights formalization program that started in 2006 and was implemented actually between 2009, 2011 with the support of Millennium Challenge Corporation. And the idea was to provide an alternative system to the customary informal set of rules that dominates rural area in terms of access to land and regulation of use in rural Benin. This reform that was implemented, is the Plan Foncier Rural, was actually an attempt to systematically identify the existing customary rights that are present in the area, and to map them, register these rights after, of course, a parcel demarcation and the recognition of each right in a specific parcel. The original intent of the reform was also to deliver certificates of property. That actually didn't really happen by 2011 when the Millennium Challenge Corporation Compact, the 5 years program compact, ended. Few certificates were awarded to the people involved in the reform, but actually the demarcation process, systematic identification, registration of these rights had already happened. And the nice thing of, or actually the backbone of our research design is that this reform was implemented as an RCT, a large-scale RCT at the village level, over approximately 600 villages that were included in the RCT process. Half were randomly selected to have the reform implemented. And by the time we visited Benin to collect data, 2018-19, the control villages in this RCT still, for the most part, I would say, yes, for the most part, did not receive any intervention or subsequent intervention. As I was telling you, after the Millennium Challenge Corporation stepped out of the program, the government didn't have the resources or power to continue the titling procedure. There were some efforts from the German cooperation that reached some of the villages, but at a later stage, mostly. There are some other legal nuances and subsequent reform, but for the most part, let's say that the original design of the reform was maintained, the randomization was successful, and we basically stepped in 7-8 years after the reform implementation and ran data collection, or actually a field experiment, to elicit distributional preferences of villagers that were included in the RCT. And specifically, I give you some of the details of the experimental design very briefly, then we can eventually go more into the technical aspect of the experiment, if you are interested. Specifically, we recruited some people online. That was only important for the beginning. We needed to create an equal allocation of resources. We had 2 agents, several pairs of agents actually, that completed effort tasks online. And by the end of the effort task, we granted to one of the 2 agents a certain amount of money, the equivalent of $1 divided in 6 coins. This was, let's say, something we did ex ante, just to have a variety of agents or pairs of agents who had an unequal distribution of resources. Just to make it clear, we replicated, for those of you who are familiar with the article of Almas and co-authors in Journal of Political Economy, we replicated the design that was used to test preferences for redistribution among US citizens and Norwegian. So once this, let's say, preliminary step was completed, we had a bunch of pairs of subjects who had an unequal distribution of resources. Sometimes this unequal distribution of resources was generated by merit considerations. The 2 individuals that were paired and that completed the effort task online had actually the resources or the coins were awarded to the individual that performed the best in the online effort task. In In another treatment or another condition, we just randomly allocated to one of the two individuals in the pair all of the coins. And with this setting, we went to conduct fieldwork in a sample of the villages that were included in the original RCT in Benin. We recruited in these villages 576 subjects, participants, half were female participants, and we explain what we had previously done in this online effort task. We presented them with the final allocation of the resources, so a pair of subjects that for some reason, either luck or either best performance, received the full allocation of the available amount of money, and the other subject that received zero. And then we ask whether the Beninese to the Beninese villager whether he or she wants to proceed with the redistribution of the original allocation. Specifically, each Beninese villager can redistribute from 0 to 6 coins to the participants. They initially have zero, an allocation of 0. Redistribution is costless in this context. The decision of the participant, the Beninese villager, is does not generate any income effect for them, but it does generate income effect, of course, for the two workers that were initially employed in the online task. With this setting, we can basically calculate which is the tolerance for the inequality, or actually the Gini index, that Beninese villagers display. Do they want to redistribute resources, and if yes, how much? And does this redistribution occurs if the initial inequality is generated by luck consideration and or by merit considerations? And this is just an overview of what happened, and we see that consistently in what we see in all the experiments with effort tasks that involves redistribution of resources. Whenever there is, whenever luck is responsible for inequalities, the redistribution that happens is much larger than when merit consideration has generated the initial inequality. This is reassuring that our participants in the villages, let's say, understood the task. I mean, the straightforward econometric specification, this is basically the main result that we have. We see that redistribution for the villagers, the Beninese villagers who have experienced the land rights formalization program compared to villagers that still have customary right, is identical when the inequality, the initial inequality, is generated by merit considerations. We do find a difference in tolerance for inequality when the initial inequality was generated by luck. And specifically, we find out that those Beninese villagers who are exposed to formalized land rights are more willing to tolerate inequality compared to control participants when inequality is generated by luck. We have a long appendix when we show all possible robustness check regarding these results in the paper. But another thing that I just want to present before opening up the discussion is that and of course everything that I'm telling to you now was pre-registered before, and we also pre-registered 3 heterogeneity analyses, specifically one that deals with, I call it market integration here, it's actually access to state facilities, and the other is about income, and the third is about gender. So specifically, we had the hypothesis that the formalization of land rights would benefit mostly those participants that have an easier access to state capacity. In the end, what we do with this land titling intervention or land rights formalization intervention is to provide documentary evidence that can be used in court, in state courts. We thought as well that wealth and income are a good proxy for the level of security of property rights, of tenure that individuals have in a village under customary system. And so we thought that individuals that are comparatively less wealthy would have probably benefited the most from the introduction of formalized land rights. And finally, we knew from previous paper of Markus Goldstein in the JDE, but also from other papers from Benin, that this intervention, this land rights formalization program, mostly improved the condition of female participants, female land tenure. So we hypothesized again that women would display a stronger effect in the reaction, the change in distributional preferences. And contrary to what usually happens when you pre-register several hypotheses, we actually got precisely what we had in mind. So that the effect is concentrated in participants who have easier access to state facilities, on participants who have relatively lower wealth, and on participants who are female in our sample. Thank you very much. Thanks. So I should have put here some slides on mechanisms, and this is probably the reason why I'm also here, because actually we didn't investigate mechanisms a lot. We designed this paper back in 2016, 17, something like this. It was possible to speculate on mechanism and still publish at a decent level. Unfortunately, we have some ideas of what could be the possible mechanism, but we don't have strong empirical evidence. Was not designed, this paper, to do so. Even the paper on the JP by Almast and Kotos, we took inspiration from, had very little or no discussion of mechanism. We thought that there are 2 possibilities. One is that introducing something that approximates more a market-like institutions might mediate this effect on tolerance for inequality and distributional preferences. There are some evidence in the literature that this could happen. We also have another, let's say, possible hypothesis that, again, we didn't test, it's just speculation. And this is that basically villagers who are in treated villages who receive these land rights formalizations are kind of playing a dissonance reduction strategy. They were lucky, they received basically for free a subsidized intervention that formalized to some extent their land tenure, and so they think that they deserve what they got by chance in the randomization, and the same is true for somebody else that just got in a weird experiment some resources by chance. We don't have good answers or a way to look at whether this speculation makes sense or not. And yes, I think I open up for the floor for the discussion. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Marco. Very interesting. I think a little bit scary kind of result. So I open the floor up for questions. Please.
So this might be a little hard to get at, but I would like to know more about how the PFR process unfurled in all of these villages, because we know kind of both from the PFR in Benin and then from, the PFR and PFR similar things have been implemented in Côte d'Ivoire and Burkina Faso as well. And in Côte d'Ivoire, it's actually been scaled up, so about like 5,000 to 6,000 villages have gone through a PFR type process. And I think what's become clear through those is that oftentimes this is a very contested process, right? Like a lot of chiefs, there's both kind of disputes between villages as to where exactly these boundaries should lie, as well as kind of disputes between individuals in the village as to what village they should belong to. So there's a lot of heterogeneity and kind of satisfaction with this process, and there's a substantial minority of individuals who are very dissatisfied with kind of where they've ended up. So I think one kind of actually a good way to get at this mechanism in terms of like, are you actually confident in your kind of institution, is to look through maybe some of the PFR records to see how kind of contested these processes were, and then you could get at some of the heterogeneity. Thanks.
Very good, thank you. Maybe any other questions? Maybe I'll just go back to Marco.
Okay, thanks for this. Yeah, I learned in this conference that it was actually the second intervention subsidized by the MCC, if not the first. So yes, there were some issues in the implementation, of course, and it created at times some problem. And I do have a paper in Journal of Law and Economics that shows that the implementation of this reform of this PFR in Benin causes an increase in disputes, in conflicts, not violent conflicts, but in disputes. So this is definitely an issue. To dig into the mechanism, I have to think about how to use this data to open up this period. I think that something that would have worked very well could be to let people just collect qualitative data and then just to analyze, process with some text analysis and something like sentiment analysis. We didn't do at that time. I didn't even know 2017 was so common to do sentiment analysis. So anyway, yeah, that's something that definitely would be nice.
Can I just have a quick two-finger on that? You might also look at how long the PFR implementation in a given village took as a kind of weak proxy for the amount of contestation, which, just to clarify, I don't view as an implementation problem. I view as kind of an essential nature of kind of formalizing boundaries between two groups.
Yeah. That's a good suggestion. Thanks.
Okay. Good. All right. Thanks a lot, Marco. It's very interesting. So our next presenter is Dustin Frye from University of Wisconsin-Madison. The paper title is Property Rights Without Transfer Rights, a study of Indian land allotment. Justin.
Yeah, I'll try to stay nearby. And then if I wander, you chase me down with that one. Yeah, that'll work. All right, thank you. Thank you for a great program and including us to be a part of it. I think from a setting standpoint, we're gonna drift a little bit differently from much of the work that we've seen. So this is a co-authored paper with Christian Dippel, who is at Western up in Canada, and my co-author Bryan Leonard, who as of today has switched his affiliation from ASU to University of Wyoming. So like the title says, we're going to focus on American Indian land allotment, a policy that begins rolling out in the 1800s. And I'll get into the policy quite a bit, but there's a couple features within it that we notice in terms of the implementation of this land rights policy. And in general, right, we're all here, we all sort of collectively know the importance of land rights, and I think one of the interesting features in our context is the way this policy is implemented is that they really transfer sort of use rights, right? These sort of usufruct rights where people have, or in this case, sort of the kind of owners have rights to use the land, but there were limitations put in place on transferability, the ability to alienate the land. This also comes through in inheritance practices and sort of limits on inheritance, okay? And so a lot of these, this type of policy or these type of limits, particularly on transferability, come from this place of sort of this, sort of colonialism, paternalism, right? The origins, in our case, it was, this sort of fear that American Indians were going to receive some property right and immediately turn around and sell it, okay? And so there were some limitations that were implemented there that sort of prevented this from happening, okay? So when we kind of look at this in the literature, often the sort of transferability piece and security are somewhat bundled together. And I think it can often be difficult to disentangle sort of just a pure kind of like limit on transferability from some of the, separate that from security at times. And I think in our context, that's really one of the like kind of key features where we think that we can kind of sharply try to point to like this is a transferability issue, because security in our context, the land in the title itself is very, very secure in sort of the environment that we're going to look at. In fact, it's in this city, in fact, that they hold all of the records for everybody that has ever sort of has any type of partial ownership over the land. So it's sort of very, very secure, but there are these transferability constraints, okay? So what specifically is the policy? So we're going to go back into the American West, back all the way into the 1880s. So this is sort of the formation of reservations is kind of complete. The frontier is sort of closed at this point, and American Indians have been relocated onto reservations. And sort of continuing in a policy of assimilation, there was kind of these coalitions of bootleggers and Baptists that kind of worked together to kind of form a land allotment policy that, kind of structurally in some ways looked like, the Homestead Act and some other policies that were rolling through the frontier in kind of a similar era, where they're granting 160 acres and these are given to individuals. But the key feature here is that this land is actually held in trust, and you can see sort of, does this work? No. Sort of in the middle slide there that trust period was set initially for a period of 25 years, okay? And so there were kind of opportunities along the way to demonstrate this word that was used was referred to as competency. There are not real guidelines here, to be clear, and so there's, this was kind of determined at the discretion of a local bureaucrat, right? A local kind of what were referred to as Indian agents, okay? But the limitations during this trust period, they couldn't sell the land, couldn't be used as collateral, and there were some real limitations in inheritance practices. Any sort of leasing on the land, required approval from, at the time it was called the Office of Indian Affairs. They got a big name update to the Bureau of Indian Affairs at some point. But there was these sort of constraints in place, right? And in some sense, the goal of the policy was again in this sort of period of assimilation, encouraging American Indians to sort of become, sort of tax-paying, church-attending farmers, frankly, right? There were these sort of broad assimilation goals. These policies really, it's a fairly long period of implementation. This is sort of the law of the land on reservations for quite a while, up until about the mid-1930s. And so in the 30s, you have both the Roosevelt administration comes in, you're in the midst of the Great Depression, and so there's sort of a general upheaval in government, and with that comes a different focus in the Office of Indian Affairs in terms of granting American Indians sort of more rights to self-governance over their land, which previously, this sort of policy was trying to squash, okay? What this practically does is that it sort of froze the land in trust in exactly 1934. So wherever that status, wherever you were in this sort of competency period, right, in 1934, you sort of were frozen, more or less, right? And what we see today is there's a mix of really tribal land, which was land that had yet to be kind of allotted through this process. There's fee simple land, which had completed the privatization process. They had kind of moved through the competency window. Or there's the allotted trust land, right? And this allotted trust land really still has this transferability constraint to it, okay? Among another feature that we'll talk about in a second, all right? So that's kind of the setting. Where do we go for data to try to understand the setting? Well, we actually lean on the Bureau of Land Management. They have sort of the General Land Office holds records for all of the patenting in the US. So really any land that is kind of in the public domain and then moves out is recorded in this transaction. Now, we don't see any subsequent activity after it's sort of, privatized, it moves from the public domain. The sort of GLO and the BLM data isn't useful. But for our purposes, when land is sort of initially allotted to an individual, we see a transaction. And then when that land eventually moves out through a fee simple, we would see a second transaction, okay? So it's sort of through this General Land Office records, we get to see kind of this process of how the land is moving. Along with a bunch of other, it's a rich source of information. We know sort of names of individuals, we know the date information, and then we know specifically where it is in a system known as the Public Land Survey System. So the Public Land Survey System, we're going to come back to the slide, don't worry. The Public Land Survey System was born out of an ordinance back in the late 1700s where, as part of Western settlement, the Western US, really, is surveyed into a grid. And so what we observe in our data is actually the placement, right? And this is sort of a sequence of kind of images, and the top right is actually the largest, and then we're sort of subsequently zooming in as you go from top right to bottom left, okay? And we can see the sort of narrow placement of these parcels in space, right? So that's part of what we're going to observe is like very, very granular kind of land and land holdings, okay? And so we're going to get a lot of detail that we can parse out of our, we're going to be able to parse this out of these sort of land descriptions that exist in that patent data. This was projected over the entire Western US. When we plot what are the parcels we see, in many cases, they largely map over what would be the boundaries of modern reservations today. Now, some reservations are missing. If you're familiar with sort of reservation locations in the Northwest, kind of the biggest omission, the biggest one that stands out would be, all right, we're going to need this. Give me this one. All right. Is it on? Now it is. Okay. The biggest omission would be in the American Southwest here in Arizona and New Mexico, which is the Navajo Reservation. Okay, this is a really large land base. And you'll notice it's not present here because much of that reservation was not allotted. Okay, so what we're really looking at would be just those reservations, and just each of these is actually one of the parcels, which ends up being mostly 160 acres. There's a few 80s floating around in there. Throughout kind of the sort of North America. And there's also, I would point out, sort of in Northern California, there's a lot more patenting than what we would associate with, any sort of reservations or what we call rancherias in California. And that's because there's actually patenting an activity that doesn't necessarily overlap with reservations. So we do see kind of everybody in a sense, right? It's a pretty exhaustive data set that way. Yeah, this is, sort of promoting using it because I think it's great. Okay. All right. What is the data? If we zoom in on one of these places, I'll show you which one. We're zooming in on one that's relatively full over in South Dakota over here. Okay. The Pine Ridge Reservation. Okay. And you can see what this checkerboarding looks like within a location. And so this is really trying to just give a visual representation of the treatment, if you will. Okay. And so this is sort of one example, one reservation, and you can see, right, there's, we're kind of taking a zoomed in area. We can see sort of in these kind of smaller sections, right? Each of these little squares is about 160 acres. You can see the reason there's some little 80s is we have these little, some of these little boundary and borders at times can be 40s or 80s. They can be a little bit smaller just because of where they sit, just in space and how the surveying was done. Okay, so the nature of the data, the nature of what we're going to observe in the treatment, you can really kind of visualize. And one of the things I sort of like about working with this paper is I get a really clear sense of kind of the comparisons that we're going to make and the comparisons that we're going to think about. I think it's pretty transparent in terms of what we're going to try to do. Okay, so how the figures are color coded, right? The orange squares, these are parcels that were started that privatization process, but didn't finish, okay? The silver squares, these are ones that completed the process, okay? The white space could either be tribal land, and much of the land sort of in this central piece is actually tribal land, and some of the white space could be land that was sold off to settlers. And so a part of this, remember this sort of bootleggers and Baptist piece, right? There was this kind of, the bootlegger part, right? There was part of this land that was made available for public sale in a period where, kind of public land sales had started to diminish in the US. And so some land on reservations was privatized and sold that way. And I think there's sort of interesting questions and work that can be done in kind of both of those tenure types, but those aren't kind of core to our comparison. Our comparison is really going to be ultimately between the orange squares and the silver squares. And we're really going to think about those that are close in space. Okay, and I'll get into identification in a second. Okay. For our outcome data, we're going to lean on the NWALT data, which is available for a bunch of different, and sort of more or less every decade, back into the mid-70s. The core of our papers kind of focuses on some of the cross-sectional pieces, so we're just going to take 2012, but in our mechanism section, we actually break out and dig into the kind of panel of the data. But given that the data doesn't change, right? The core of the sort of treatment doesn't change from 1974 to 2012. There's not a lot of kind of useful variation necessarily in that, okay? We also put kind of in the latest version, I sort of preface this, if you pull the version off the internet today, it'll look different than the version that's gonna be on the internet in 10 days. Because we're kind of in the refereeing and reviewing process at the moment. And so part of what has changed and what feels very different in the current version is the number of land characteristics that we know for each of those individual parcels and pixels. Okay, so we tried to grab kind of what we knew about what we could find that we thought was relevant for kind of, the early 1900s. Okay, that NWALT data, this gives just kind of a snapshot of what these pixels look like. And really, you can see kind of developed pixels are in the red. We're going to think about these on the extensive margin. Do we have a developed pixel? And then we're going to focus on cultivated pixels, which are, then we're going to think about kind of an area, the share of the land that's in, kind of that green, mossy green color. Okay, and those are going to be the two major outcomes of interest. Okay. the thing that's kind of kept us up at night is, of course, thinking about kind of selection in two ways, right? It's selection in the characteristics of land, and selection into kind of who these owners were, okay? And who these allottees were, and maybe who their heirs were in some fashion. And so most of our empirical strategy is really focused on addressing these two forms of selection. Largely, we're going to most of the work is done through kind of spatial fixed effects to try to address the top piece. We do have some variable selection models that we can include, and we throw matching estimators in kind of narrowly in space. We do some randomized inference tests to really try to minimize those spatial differences. Okay, and then to address really the move on selection on individuals, we really focus on family names, right? So we have names from the original allottee records. We think about family names sort of in a narrow geography, right? So we've done it a little bit at the entire reservation, and then we do it kind of family names in a 6x6 space, because families are sort of often allotted in somewhat close proximity. Okay. Given the approach, we actually have a pretty straightforward estimating equation. Really, we have a binary treatment, which was this sort of fee simple, is whether or not your land was eventually privatized. As I mentioned, the outcomes of interest are going to be whether we have any development in this 160-acre parcel, and then the share of that parcel that is cultivated. Those are really our two outcomes of interest. These sort of kappa J's, these are our kind of spatial fixed effects. We used to, in the old version of the paper, we had kind of more of these. The current version, we're going to really focus on section fixed effects. And so a section is really going to be comparing then like essentially 4 160-acre squares. That is basically going to make up a section. So we are zooming kind of way in space and more or less thinking about you kind of with like these sort of 3 neighbors that share your space in the PLSS system. We include, again, these sort of family name fixed effects, which we think are pretty relevant in this setting. I mean, there's still, it's in a period with, sort of chiefs and clans and sort of, pretty strong kind of family norms that are defining decisions. And so we kind of feel like that actually does a lot for us. And then, as I mentioned, we include a couple parcel level traits through this variable selection model. Okay, there's a lot of numbers going on in this table, so I'm going to just focus on a couple of them. Okay, the first 4 columns here just focus on development. Okay, you can see across specifications, what we're stepping in are these family named fixed effects, and we're really robust to the inclusion of those, and in fact, the coefficient. It's fairly stable. And so there's about, a 1.5 to 2 kind of percentage point increase, which on the base, this is what you'll see in the abstract, is about a 13% increase in the likelihood of having any development. Turning to cultivation, we have sort of, this is again measured as a share, so it's again this sort of about a 4 percentage point increase in cultivation, which ends up being about 35%, kind of at the relative to the mean. So, we think of these as being kind of fairly meaningful, just in terms of sort of their magnitude and what they're telling us. Okay. With my last couple minutes, I'm going to highlight kind of 2 mechanisms that we think we can speak to in this context. And so the first one, we focus on credit access. And we kind of hypothesize, this largely, we're going to think about this on the extensive margin. And what we find is it really keys on development, not as much on agriculture. And I think that's more about the kind of nature of agriculture on American Indian reservations, even today. The second mechanism we want to look at actually focuses on a piece of this puzzle that we haven't talked about yet, but it does deal with the inheritance practices. So how inheritance works on American Indian reservations. When you don't have the ability to sort of, separate and transfer, you can't actually kind of, partition the land or subdivide it with heirs, right? In the way we would have typically seen in the American West. And so what you have is the accumulation of heirs over time. Okay, so some parcels will have hundreds, if not thousands, of co-owners. Okay, and what we tend to see is that this is actually ends up being kind of more negatively impactful on agricultural decisions, because a lot of ag is kind of done through leasing, and it just raises the transaction costs, because the old rules, specifically in this development, is you had to have unanimous agreement in order to enter into a lease. And when you have 1,000 relatives who don't talk to each other, it can be tough to do. Okay, so there was a lot of kind of unused land. Okay, so a little bit of how do we get there for both of these mechanisms. For credit access, this is one of the features that's different about this edition of the paper. We actually leverage state-level bank deregulation and sort of how banking laws are changing and opening up the supply of credit differentially by state. And then we can actually kind of look at that variation to see what happens in states that effectively deregulate kind of sooner than others, and this leans into that kind of panel variation. Okay, and largely we find that bank deregulation, right, with where banks deregulate earlier with fee simple parcels leads to, that's really what's driving a lot of these development differences. Fractionation, this part about inheritance, we actually go through, we don't observe the number of heirs for any individual parcel. That's confidently held or confidentially held in one of the buildings in this city, wherever the BIA is. Random story, and I'm out of time, so we're gonna go quick. Apparently somebody at one point let a disk slip out that they shouldn't have, so there's one paper that has data about this, and none of the rest of us get to use it, so we have to make it up. Not make it up like make it up, but like we have to find a different workaround. And so we tried to find a way to measure latent fractionation by building an archival census roll so that we can actually map individuals to understand, hey, what is, for people that we can then match by name, can we see their heirs and can we find people and when they may have died? And so we use this thing we call latent fractionation to give us a sense for the potential for this sort of proliferation of heirs. And what we find working through this is we find, that places that we predict would have lots of heirs, I should say, end up having kind of worse agricultural outcomes, especially conditional on those being allotted earlier. Okay, and that's really the paper in its core. We have these kind of main effects, which find, land privatization seems to have increased the level of development. Like I said, the kind of punchline takeaways are 13% for development and 35% for agricultural cultivation. The big challenges that we see with development point to credit, and I think the challenges in ag tend to come back to this thing that's called fractionation in the literature here, which is really the number of heirs. Okay, there's some sort of punchline things in terms of cautions that we have about how we conceive and design some of these land titling efforts. And here's, I think, an example where we didn't maybe conceive it and kind of think of it maybe completely. So, thank you.
Great, thanks a lot, Justin. Very interesting. In terms of the contemporary sort of applications, in the World Bank, we support a lot of formalization of informal settlements, and quite often, government put on the transferability sort of constraints. So I'm not sure we have any systematic study on the implications. So this is a really interesting, relevant study. Let me just open the floor for questions, please.
Thanks so much. Awesome study. I'm curious, so you kind of motivated this partly that the restrictions on transferability were largely done out of this paternalistic view that Indians might sell off a lot of their land immediately upon receipt. And I'm curious whether you've had any luck in kind of exploring that avenue. We see these development outcomes. Does that actually lead to improvements for the communities that were receiving those lands, or is that something that's far beyond what's possible with the existing data?
So, yeah, I think we may be able to do a little bit to just sort of see how quickly, sort of like, the thing we can't observe, let me say this. The thing we can't observe is actually like, all right, when was a person maybe, declared, say, competent? And then we see sort of the title move into their name at that point. And then we don't really get to see the subsequence, right? So in this world of like, how do we see when these things are changing? I mean, I think what we do know is that we see some policy relaxation around trying to make that happen more quickly. I think what kind of happened is that the government sort of said, all right, 25 years, and then the next kind of administration went through and they went, how long, right? Like, how long do we have to wait? And then there were sort of like subsequent rules around, oh, well, if you pass away, maybe we can get access to it sooner. And then they made sort of these commissions in the early 1900s that just went around trying to kind of like declare competency more quickly. So we see like kind of big picture examples of the government maybe trying to relax some of that. But it's tough to know like, definitively, how much, how that's really kind of working and kind of on an individual decision basis. I don't know what we could do to really observe it. There is a world we could maybe, we see everybody in the census, and so we could think about kind of family level decisions, and I think this is a frontier that we're considering is everything, at the individual level. What does it mean to kind of be making collective family level decisions when you have kind of a portfolio of land and assets? And then maybe there's some work that could be done there, right? To sort of see how a portfolio is managed as opposed to sort of plot by plot. Does that make sense? Yeah, thank you.
Yes, please.
Let me perhaps a little bit of confusion, because I come from a different tradition of the Anglo-Saxon, come from the use of property rights. Mm-hmm. The thing is, how can we call property right something that it has no transferability? In that sense, in other traditions, when there is that restriction from governments, we use another category, not property rights, but an administrative concession.
Okay.
That could explain that limits that establish the states, and you say very well at the end, it's an incomplete land right. That incomplete land right is another thing. It's not clearly a property right.
That's true, right? I think we do have, kind of in the different dimensions of sort of the full property right. That's right. I think that's absolutely true, right? What the kind of allotted pieces or the orange pieces in those pictures were certainly just incomplete. I think that's totally fair. Yeah. We can go to happy hour. Well, get closer to happy hour. Yeah.
So, yep, get closer to. Thanks a lot, Justin. That's great. Thank you. All right. So our next presenter is Gharad Bryan from London School of Economics. His presentation is titled Market Design for Land Trade, Evidence from Uganda and Kenya.
Okay, thank you very much for having me. I'll try to be fast so we can get off and have some drinks. I have a relatively simple goal here, which is to convince you that we should take the design of land markets more seriously. So let me tell you what market design is. So even if you have a right to a piece of property, there are rules, formal or informal, that govern how you go about trading that. And this is true of nearly all the markets that we interact in. So for example, we're aware directly that eBay has a market design. It's a second price auction in which there is a reserve price. And you may be aware of these things in more formal markets like eBay, but they are there in all markets. For example, if I want to go and buy some antiques, I will usually go to an antique fair, and there will be bargaining, not posted prices, and that's the institutional rules under which an antique is sold, and it has particular costs and benefits. Okay, so that's where we are. So my motivation here is, and I think we all know this, that farms in developing countries are small, they are fragmented, and they are potentially misallocated. So, and this maybe leads to low agricultural productivity. That's my interest. The estimates in the literature are a little all over the shop, but misallocation maybe accounts for 20 to 300% increases in agricultural productivity. Even if it's the 20, that's well worthwhile having. There's less on getting to optimal farm size, but there's one good estimate in the literature, and that suggests a 70% increase in productivity if we could get to optimal farm size. Okay, so what do we want to do about this? Well, just to give you a more graphic representation of this, and I suppose you guys have all seen things like this, this is one part of Kasuro district in Uganda where we've been working. This is an aerial photograph, and that is a single plot that you can see from the air, and it's 0.06 hectares in size. It is very, very small. On the right, we've been mapping in the same area who owns each of the plots that you can see on this map. And what I want you to see here is A, the plots are very small, but B, people own a lot of them and they're spread out all over the place. So if we look at this guy in red, here, you can see that he has 6 plots of land, all of strange irregular shapes and spread out around his village. Maybe it's not a he, I don't actually know. Okay, so that's the fragmentation problem, and the misallocation problem is, well, we don't know whether this land is with the right people. Okay. Now, oh, maybe I've said all of this. The historical solution to this problem is top-down. So a geographer working for the land department comes and works with the village over years to remap all the agricultural land and reallocate it across people. It is, I guess, a market design institution, and sometimes there's some voting involved, and sometimes there's, you know, people with guns taking your land away from you. Okay, so that's the sort of background. And what we think is that potentially markets are a better solution than that top-down kind of approach, because in environments that have a lack of information, low state capacity and potential coercion, markets, on the other hand, are voluntary, participatory, and can be organized to be within community, avoiding land grabs and taking of land from poorer people. Okay, so what am I going to try and argue to you today? Well, I'm going to try to argue that farmers believe that their environment has the characteristics that theory tells us will make trade very hard without good market design. Second, I'm going to use a lab in the field experiment to show you that even with perfect institutions, in an environment that I think is a good representation of land markets, people can't trade land well. And finally, I'm going to try to convince you that some simple market design interventions can be understood by relatively low numeracy agricultural landholders, and that they can use those to increase their agricultural productivity, again, in lab in the field type work. And you'll see why I'm doing lab in the field, because if you want to try to convince a government to let me do market design in land markets, I'll be very happy. So. Okay. Here is my schematic representation of the land market and its key properties. So on the left, I've got an initial allocation. The land at the top with 3 bushels of corn is productive, and the land at the bottom with 1 bushel of corn is unproductive. Farmers who are green are high productivity, and farmers who are blue are low productivity. And the 4 characteristics that I think we have in land markets are the follows. One is consolidation is good. Having all your plots together means you can be more productive. Large farms are good. So that means in the efficient allocation on the right, everyone has all their plots together. The second thing is sorting. In the efficient allocation on the right, all the green guys are at the top and all the blue guys are at the bottom. Good farmers on good land, bad farmers on bad land. The third is there's decreasing returns to scale at the farm level. That means that a single individual can't farm the entire community. That's why everyone only has a farm size of 3 here, rather than the most efficient guy farming the entirety of what's going on. The third is that there are strong cultural constraints here, which is why some of the plots are white and you cannot trade them. They're not available. Okay, and there's also got to be private information. Okay, so that's what I think the land trade problem is. So let me tell you why I think this is a hard problem. There are the land trade problem is to get from the left to the right. How do you get there? Okay. Why is it hard? There are 3 problems that the market design literature recognizes that are going to make this a challenge. The first is that land markets are inherently thin. So let's consider my guy 17, and he wants to have 3 contiguous plots of land. Well, let's suppose he tries to trade with person 7. The only people who could plausibly want plot 7 over on the right there are farmer 17 and farmer 8. There are only 2 buyers, there's only 1 seller. That is a very, very thin market, and decades of economics tells us that thin markets aren't efficient. Okay. The second is exposure risk. Well, let's suppose that 17 decides to buy this nice plot next to him belonging to 9. 9 only makes that trade because he thinks he can buy the plot 12 that's between his 2 plots. But now he's a motivated buyer. 12 knows that, and 12 holds him up so that he can't get through the entire trade. Finally, there are coordination frictions here, and let me name 2 of them. The first is that my exposure problem is vast because the chains to get from inefficient to efficient are very, very, very long. You can calculate it here, and it's something like 100 trades are involved in the move required to get to the efficient outcome. Okay? So finding that set of trades is really, really difficult. The second is a packing problem. So the more of these white squares we have, the fewer optimal packings there are. So you can see this because let's suppose that 17 buys the plot 7 over there. There's now no way to have everyone on consolidated farms. You would have to undo that trade to get back into an efficient spot, and all of that means that unregulated trade is extraordinarily difficult here. Okay, so what then does a market design do? Well, it has these 3 goals to solve these problems. We want to thicken markets. That's why we have antique fairs. Antiques are a thin market, so we get together once a month to trade antiques, not every day in a market, and that means there are more buyers and sellers, thicker markets. So we could just get people into the same room. That's a market design. The second thing a market design does is it attempts to enforce contracts. I will sell you my plot of land if I can buy this plot of land. The UK allows you to sign such a contract, and all offers to buy land are conditional on your selling your own land. Australia does not allow you to make that trade, and so that's a market design decision. Finally, a market design helps to try and find chains. I'm going to do this in a complicated way in a second, but a simple version of this is just an estate agent who goes to try and say, well, okay, you'll only buy Klaus's land if you can sell your land. Let me try and find you a buyer for your land. As we see in Lorenzo's wonderful discussion of his paper, finding actual buyers is one of the big problems in land markets. Who wants to buy my land? Okay. So, one final thing about market design is I could rank the different kinds of interventions from very generic to more tailored to the situation. And more generic market designs we all understand how to use. Anyone can go to an antique fair. More tailored market designs require more institutional understanding and knowledge. Operating on a second price auction on eBay, maybe you want to understand some of the incentives that are involved in that. And I'm going to show you a combinatorial auction in a second. That's really hard for even me to describe, okay? And so whilst tailored market designs might be in theory the best thing to do, in practice they might just not work at all, okay? So, what am I going to show you now? I'm going to show you evidence that this representation is consistent with the way that Ugandan farmers see their own environment. It's not only important that my representation is true of the production function, but also that farmers believe it is true, because if they don't believe it is true, they will not try to trade and they won't face any of these problems. Then I'm going to try to convince you that this is actually a hard problem. What I've argued to in theory is actually true, at least when I try to get people to trade in that exact environment. And finally, I'm going to try to argue to you that market design can improve this situation. Okay. Is our representation any good? So we're going to survey of 1,404 land-owning farmers in Masaka in Uganda. 10% of them have bought or sold land ever. 20% of them have rented out or in land in the last 12 months. There are land rental markets and land sale markets in this environment. Despite this, 64% of our sample have fragmented farms, and on average, they walk about 20 to 40 minutes between their plots. Okay. So do farmers believe there are consolidation gains? Well, 25% of my farmers have tried to consolidate their land, and only half of them have succeeded. 91% of them would prefer to have one 2-acre plot than to have two 1-acre plots. They think that there are increasing returns to scale. The second, do they believe there are sorting gains? 99% of them believe that there are good farmers and bad farmers in their village, and they guess that the best farmers would produce 3 times as much on the same land as the worst farmer would. 99% think that there is land quality heterogeneity, good land and bad land, and 99% of the farmers agree with the statement that productivity would be higher if the best farmers farmed the best land. So they believe there is a sorting problem here. Do they believe that there are decreasing returns to scale? Yes, they do believe that there are decreasing returns to scale. 40% believe that they couldn't even farm more than they currently have. That means that if they bought a piece of land, they'd be stuck with it and not farming it, and then they have this exposure or hold-up problem I talked about. They also believe there's strong heterogeneity in how much land a good and a bad farmer can farm. Good farmers, they think, could handle up to 5 acres, and bad farmers only 3/4 of an acre. Finally, they strongly believe there are cultural constraints which restrict their trade. Okay. So this leads me to believe that they think my representation of their problem is relatively good. Okay. So now I'm going to try to see whether they can solve the problem as I have posted it. This is what we do with them. We have 68 villages in Masaka district in Uganda. They play they play games. Basically, it's like Monopoly. There are 18 players. They each start with 3 plots of land. It's exactly the same as I represented to you earlier. And they are given paper game money to try and trade. So, for example, this is, I can't point, that the individual in bold, those are the plots of land that you start with, and you're trying to move to your optimal allocation. They are given a relatively large amount of money to try to solve the problem. They're given 1 day's wages in a show-up fee, and if they trade well, they will earn about 2.2 days' wages in total. And they're allowed to do this over 7 days. Okay. So, what happens? Well, first of all, let me tell you that they can trade in markets. So on the left, we have the efficiency that they can extract with the sorts of games that I like to play with my undergraduate students. So the first one on the left just gives them an allocation of a trinket, tells them their value for it, and gets them to walk around trading this. Can they trade a trinket? And they reach 90% efficiency. The second one, they have 3 trinkets, and they need to trade multiple things. And they walk around, and they get to 90% efficiency. On the right, then, are their efficiency in our games, which we believe represent these 4 characteristics of land trade. So they get to about 30% efficiency at the end of the trading. That's in the first week. And in the second week, they do even worse. I'll have a little No, I don't have time, but I do have an explanation. We did the second week because we thought they'd get better. Yeah. So this is very, very low efficiency. They're better at some things than at other things. On the left is their total efficiency in week 2, and that can be broken up into how well did they solve the consolidation problem, how well did they solve the sorting problem, and how many people ended up holding a piece of land that was useless because of the exposure problem. They engaged in a trade, it was a bad idea, and they couldn't unwind that trade. That's our explanation for why things get worse over time, by the way. They learn that they can end up in a bad situation. So as you see, they're relatively good at consolidation. They're very bad, well, they're relatively bad at sorting. It's a harder problem. And they're very, very bad because they end up with these exposed trades. Okay, does market design help? Well, in this context, we do a very, very simple thing, which is bring them together and allow them to trade all together in one day in one room that we set up, the equivalent of the antiques fair. What is this supposed to do? Well, it thickens the market. Everyone who might buy your piece of land is there in front of you. It can support enforcement. If I offer to buy Klaus's land, if he's willing to sell a piece of land over here, I make that offer in front of all my friends and colleagues from the village, and if I renege on it, then I'm going to get in trouble. Finally, it can help facilitate bargaining over trains if we are all in the same room. Okay? But it's very untailored to the problem. How badly am I doing on time? Not that badly. Okay. Efficiency goes up a lot. We get from 10% efficiency to maybe 40% efficiency. Consolidation is where the gains come from, and unwinding of bad trades. But they cannot solve the sorting problem in this complicated environment. This is super interesting because the market design literature is mostly about sorting. And in classic games like I showed you here, this is a sorting game, and they do extraordinarily well. The issue is here is the additional problems that you have of this geographic representation and the need to take care of the consolidation games at the same time. Okay, so maybe just very, very simple things work here. What's interesting is that nearly every single group well, not nearly every, about 70% of groups tried to organize a similar kind of institution. But systematically they report to us that they didn't get a lot of people showing up, and the groups that did try did no better than the groups that did not. It is hard to organize an institution. It is a coordination mechanism that benefits some people but not all, and it's hard to get full agreement on it. Okay. Now I'm going to talk to you about what's a really well-tailored solution to this problem, and this is a combinatorial auction, and I'll try to explain it a little bit. Because it's complicated, we shrink the problem down to just 6 farmers with 2 plots each, 12 plots of land. Okay. They interact through a computer, and the computer allows them to do the following things. The first treatment is a continuous double auction in which I can buy or sell 1 plot at a time. So I enter into the computer, I would like to buy plot 3, and my willingness to pay is $300. If you've never done this with an undergraduate class, it is well worth doing and very enjoyable. Markets work. The second is a swap intervention. This is a chain. I specify that I can buy plot 3 and sell plot 7, but only if I can pay at most $50. So this is trying to deal with my chain problem. I've got these conditional trades. The final is a full package auction where I can specify that I'm willing to buy and sell up to 2 plots. So I will buy plots 9 and 10 and sell plots 2 and 5 if I receive at least $200. Given the design here, this allows your choices to be completely separate from your initial allocation. I say, I'm willing to sell my initial allocation, and here are my prices for all of the consolidated farms in the entire thing. So in principle, it should solve all of our problems. It thickens the markets because everyone is bidding on every single farm. It enforces the contracts because the computer enforces the contracts. And in the background here, I've also got a computer that's finding all of the optimal chains. So you put your bid in here, and the computer finds what the best trades are and actuates only those that are good. Now, this is close, maybe close to the optimal design, but I think we can agree that it's complicated. So this is well tailored, but can I get low numeracy Kenyan farmers in this case to understand? Okay, so here are my results. First of all, even in my simplest treatment, they do relatively well, indicating they can use the computer framework, etc., and it's relatively straightforward. And then as I increase the complexity of adding in these combinatorial parts of the auction, they actually do better and better. Their amount of efficiency increases by about 8% of their baseline efficiency overall. But interestingly, it doesn't improve their ability to consolidate, which they were already relatively good at. This more complicated intervention helps them to to sort the better farmers to the better pieces of land, okay, which was the gains that we couldn't get earlier. Now, final thoughts. One additional piece of information. Market design does this, and all at the same time, it reduces the amount of inequality in our experiments. This is a big thing in these environments because you don't want trade to increase inequality. So what do we think? 4 main points. First of all, hopefully I've convinced you that even if you have property rights, land trade is hard. So the rules according to which you trade matter. Simple centralization, just simple market designs and basic institutions could plausibly help this quite a lot. We are used to real estate agents. What does that do in agricultural land markets? But even more interesting for me, that when I tailor my designs to the specific situation, I do find that farmers can understand and make use of a technology that seems really very complicated. Okay, so market design can work in what is potentially a difficult setting. Thank you very much.
Very interesting, Gharad. Thanks a lot. A lot of games being played here. Let me open up, please.
Very interesting talk. I was thinking when you were talking about the constraint, like can behavioral biases or other type of constraints, such as not thinking about that side option, play a role? And then if that's the case, like a training to improve the negotiation skills of those farmers could also play a role.
Yeah, so training on what is the question? Well, okay, I'll answer anyway. Training on what is the question that I have? So when you talk to farmers, and this is just anecdotal, they all understand that they have a fragmentation problem. They all understand that it's difficult to get these trades happening, and they all understand that it's hard to find these chains. So that's an understanding. The question is, what do I train them to be able to do? I do think that it's an interesting question to see whether the market design interventions would work better if you get people really, really well trained beforehand, which is what you'd have to do if you wanted to do this in the real world. Yeah. But yes, behavioral constraints are surely here, because otherwise they'd solve this problem.
So you're thinking about this as a mechanism, the training,
as
a mechanism to make like the market design work even better.
Yeah.
I see.
Yep.
Hi, I wonder whether your experiments and everything talk about like this other explanation in this field, which is like liquidity constraints and absence of credit markets. Can you touch upon this, just out of curiosity? Thanks.
So credit constraints will make all of these problems worse. That's fairly easy to see, that the exposure problem, for example, is exacerbated by the absence of credit. So if I want to buy your land and sell my own land, I've got to buy your land on credit and pay incredibly high price before I trade. So that will matter. Interestingly, we have credit interactions in the last experiments I showed you, and the credit doesn't matter once you have the package design, the more complicated auction design, which is one of its features because I don't have to have that buy first, sell later problem there. There's interesting interactions in my mind between this and other markets. So why have well-functioning mortgage markets for land if the market design problem means nobody's trading land? Why have good rental markets for tractors if people continue to have small fragmented land? So I think there's fairly strong complementarities across these things if you think about them together.
I see, thanks.
I'm not a market design person, so forgive me if this is a really elementary question. But how well does your market design work when the optimal level of fragmentation is not zero? So we can think about a variety of contexts. I'm thinking of the Senegalese one specifically, where there's kind of this preference for, low fragmentation, but non-zero fragmentation as a kind of informal insurance against, both against kind of droughts and other national disasters, but also because they're kind of household divisions for different types of crop. Men farm rice, women farm kind of market vegetables, and those require very different soil types.
So I think this is one of the advantages of markets. In fact, it is the advantage of markets, which is that what they're trying to do is extract the information held by the individual. So if the individual believes that fragmentation is what they want, they can express that through a market by having low demand and low price for consolidation. That's in distinction to nearly all top-down solutions to these problems, where somebody else is dictating what happens. I tried to pitch this, the first government I tried to pitch this to of many is the Rwandan government. And they just kept asking me to tell them what would be the best allocation of land, and while I was there, who should farm what where. And the thing I kept saying is, I don't know the answer to that question. Perhaps we could try in a structured way to ask the farmers themselves what their view is. The market design view is, we want to ask the farmers, but we're concerned about incentive compatibility. So how do we get their information, help them to make trades, but respect the fact that they have incentives to kind of not tell us always the truth? That's the goal, yeah.
Yes. Oh. I think two questions. One is your sorting problem difficult because ability is private information? And the second one is, do you have any real world or any idea of what the magnitudes may be in the real world? And why I think if that can be implemented on a computer, why is there not some private guy implementing that and charging a transaction fee? That would actually be an efficient solution.
On the first question, which I forgot, so remind me a little bit.
That was the ability private information.
So why is the sorting harder than the consolidation? So there's a market designer who's on the paper, and there's a section in the paper that explains this, so let me do my best. Consolidation is obvious to everyone. The fact that you want to consolidate is common knowledge, and so it is a less difficult information problem. Sorting is a private information problem. I want to trade to your piece of land, but I don't know what your value for the piece of land is. So that is why the sorting ought to be a more challenging problem. One of the things we want to try to do is to get real-world maps to describe so there's metrics for describing how difficult this problem is. We've got some in the paper, like how hard is this problem? And you could develop metrics for it under assumptions about what the efficient allocation is. To this point, we haven't got access, apart from in our 20 villages in Uganda, to data that will allow us to do this. And we only got those 20 villages a couple of months ago. But I think it's an interesting, a good question.
Yes, interesting paper. Thanks so much. Yeah, just to raise the question, in the real world, especially in the context of climate vulnerability, land fragmentation is one problem, but they looked at that as insurance, okay? How we do factor that kind of social knowledge in the community in your model. Thank you.
Yeah, so we do ask this. We ask them a whole barrage of questions about how they would like their land to be allocated. And some people do say that there are insurance benefits to having some fragmentation, but the preponderance of people in our data say that actually having the land together is far more beneficial for them. In this context, we think they have some social insurance that already exists. They speak of relatively good social norms for moving money across people in the event that your consolidated farm does badly. So maybe they have some access to that sort of within village insurance, which is all you could get from fragmented plots anyway. But that's just anecdotal speculation. Yeah, I mean, the more, it has the same point I made earlier as well, which is that defragmenting the land, the value of doing that will depend on the quality of the insurance markets. So there's complementarity here between the workings of the different markets, I think, yeah.
Okay, last question, thanks.
So super interesting. I'm wondering if you've thought how this problem changes if there's a segment of the population that is landless but has savings of some sort. I ask because I imagine like you can pose a problem like this, or you can also like fix the distribution of land and then just change across the distribution of abilities of people. So and you can purportedly find an efficient allocation if you like loop over enough people. No?
So you're thinking about people who don't own land but have money.
Right, and that can engage in land sales, have some ability to farm, and would fit the like fixed plot.
So if this is the same as the spectrum reallocation problem for people who like market design, and there what they do is the government buys up all the land in a reverse auction and then resells it. So in that sense, we know that a money bags that has no credit constraint and can buy up all the land and then freely resell it makes the problem easier. The opposite is also true. A person who has a large plot of land and wants to move off it makes the problem easier because it relaxes this packing problem. So I want you to think about that little game where you have to move the tiny squares around and get them all ordered by color. And imagine I take out one more square and allow you to move them around more freely. It makes it easier to get it done. So those are known from the market design literature. And one manifestation of this is the idea of land banks. And actually Rwanda has land banks to try and maybe help with this. Yeah.
All right. Thanks a lot, Gharad.
Thank you very much.
Very interesting, thank you. Our last paper for this afternoon is by actually Klaus and colleagues. Our presenter is Abhiman Das from India Institute of Management in Ahmedabad. The title of the paper is Credit Impacts of Titling Rural Habitation Land, Evidence from India's SVAMITVA scheme.
Okay, the last paper of the day, I know it's a bit tiring for all of us. Thank you, the World Bank, and particularly Klaus for having me here. And I am a macroeconomist. I am not a land economist per se. But the best way to work on land to get a man of land. Okay, so Klaus is on board, and we have been working with a team at Indian Institute of Management, Ahmedabad. I come from a business school, and a couple of colleagues at the World Bank. So I think this is one of the most simplest paper of the day, possibly. What we are trying to do is to show that if you can have a technology intervention to provide some means as a proof of your legal rights that can be used as a collateral for credit. Okay, that's the key questions what we are going to address in this. I think during the tea break, while talking to Bryan, he was just simply asking, does it work? And to tell you frankly, Bryan, what in the very early stage of results, what we are saying is it works. And we are talking about not on a RCT, not a quasi-experiment. It's a policy intervention for pan-India we are talking about. Okay, it's not a one state or two states we are talking about. We are talking about all villages of India, but at present we do not have data for everything. We are going to show you results only for a particular state relative to some other states. Okay, so it's a hugely work in progress. The constraints, of course, with the data. As we move forward, possibly there is a lot of promise to this project. Okay, so I work with three of my colleagues there at Ahmedabad. So let me just begin with the kind of context. If you talk about India today, and if you do not talk about India's technology revolution, then possibly we are not talking about India and India's growth story. So during last I think 15 years or so, there is remarkable change in technology in India. And this has shown effect in every sectors. This started with, I think, one of the biggest experiment of giving identity to individual. And many of you know the name of that experiment was, or again, Aadhaar. Aadhaar in simple terms means holder or foundation. In fact, the person possibly who designed it never thought that that will become the foundation of India's technology revolution itself. So it started with Aadhaar giving an identity, and then from there, it basically built on stack by stack over that identity layer. So it started with identity, you built over that identity with payments layer, and payments layer has been one of the biggest, I think, success stories of India. Just to give one example, as of today, daily UPI, that Unified Payment Interface, UPI transaction is daily, as of today, is 443 millions per day. That's the size of the transactions we are talking about. Okay, that's the technology, strength we are talking about today. And the idea is another 3-4 years down the line, possibly we can expect daily 1 billion transaction, which can support by this the payments layer. On top of it, you have a data layer where with consent basis, then you can work and interoperability, which helps. And then all these things are actually made as a public digital interface. And that's the best part of it, Because it is public, you have hundreds and thousands of apps which are working, which are helping people to transact, and people to transact without even a bank account. Okay, that's the way it is. But this is one side of only technology revolution what we are seeing. Do you think that technology revolution can be used in the land market? That's the part what we are going to talk about. Okay, the some of the context, I think already I spoke about, this has led to increase in revenue collection, quality of public procurement. These are all top class, I think, papers which have come based on India's technology, improvement. It has improved financial inclusion a lot. Saving from, reducing leakage due to direct benefit transfer, that has been documented and which is substantial. Okay, so against this context, what is more puzzling is the following. That Indian land market, it's not that Indian land market titles were not there. Because of our colonial history, most of the agricultural lands titles were available. Because that allowed Indian or the government to collect taxes, which is no longer there. Now, I think for most of the agricultural market, taxes are not there. But in the process, what was left out is your habitat land. Habitat land rights were not even, thought of or even if it was thought of, there was no way it could be done because it was never even surveyed. Okay, so and this is something of a paradox. A country which has so much of banking is the I think engine for India's growth, but somehow land as a collateral has never worked in India. And there is huge disparity between both the land as a collateral if you think about the urban and rural. In urban, house as a collateral, it has worked, and you will not believe that the mortgage is actually missing in the entire rural India. The concept of mortgage does not, it's not there, simply not there. So in that context, what you find is that it's not that rural people do not need a home. They do. So what we found that most of these rights for the area where you live was never formally surveyed, not given any title to them. This experiment is trying to give that legal right to those who are, to every property holder of India. You can see the massive scale of operation, what we are going to talk about. The idea is, again, the basic idea is, if the digital infrastructure of ID and payment system can be combined together to create a legal rights for the rural habitats, can that lead to increase in credit? That's the key questions we are going to talk about. Okay, so my context is kind of, I think this has some macro, implications also. Historically, India's financial deepening has been reasonably weak compared to many other Southeast Asian countries. The credit as a percentage of GDP has been much lower. It's not even 60% relative to many other East Asian countries. So this has other implications also if it works. So this is the policy initiative. What it does, it's the policy name is SVAMITVA. SVAMITVA again is a Hindi or Sanskrit terminology, which means exactly ownership. And India, if you follow Indian political economy, you will know that the current political establishment, including the current prime ministers, he likes acronyms, okay? He likes acronyms a lot. And this is where you find an acronym which is trying to match with SVAMITVA means ownership with SVAMITVA, which means Survey of Villages, Abadi means resident or residential area, and mapping with improvised technology in village areas. That's the plan. So what how do you do that? First of all, it's very hard to survey, but in order to do that, we are talking about several departments of the ministry, and that has to work together. We are talking about rural India. That means it has to be dealt with Ministry of Panchayati Raj, which is governing the kind of working of rural setup. And then you need to work with Department of Land Resources. The first thing what was done was the state level Revenue Act was changed, which gave them right to go for this work, okay? The first is legal enactment that was changed. There was an expert committee of, I think, 20, 25 people who worked together. They provided the roadmap to go ahead with this. So what it proposed that first is establishing a legal basis for documenting the land ownership in habitation areas, implement a systematic, low-cost digital process. Again, I think during tea break, I was talking to Klaus. Just to give one example, the cost for one village for this experiment, for this policy intervention is $142. For one property, it is $0.4. It is as cheap as that can be done. Okay, again, I think Klaus was talking, people are available who will do the surveys and other stuff in India, but it is the technology which is helping us in a big way. So the steps are kind of, the Commissioner of Land Rights starts the process, then the notification, and after the notification, it goes to a revenue case management system. There are several layers, and along that layer, once you are kind of ready to go for survey, you allow drones, before going to the survey, you allow people to put stone lime boundaries around your habitat land and use your community power to give some idea who owns what. Once that is done, you allow a drone to fly, take a picture of that. Then that drone picture is actually digitized. Now, this is where technology comes in a big way. And then, it's not easy that there will not be any conflict. Of course, there will be. Since there will be conflict, the role of local government comes. There is, local government which sits together, try to resolve, and if it is not resolved, again goes back. So it's a process which takes forward. And then finally, there is, when the agreements are there, conflicts are resolved, you issue one property card. So the property card becomes the ownership right given to the individual property holder. Now this card, another basic, nice thing about the entire plan was the idea of this scheme itself says that if I give you a property card, you can go to a bank to ask loan. So it is not that this is going to influence. The purpose itself says that it has to be used to get credit. That's the beauty of this. So this is what I think the steps what I have spoken about. Target is 500,000 villages, of which 350,000 villages have been notified. Program had already mapped and distributed property cards of more than 80 and 10 million parcels. Respectively close to 3/4 of the latter in the states of UP and MP. And why do we talk about UP and MP will be in a moment I'm going to talk about. Okay, so what do we do in this paper? Particularly, it's again, I am saying, this is a very simple paper. We map village level, village level property card holder, so village level with the bank branch mapping. This is again, it's not easy, So once we map that, can we identify the effect of property card holder on the credit uptake? Okay, it's a simple, two-way fixed effects DID design. We are still not there even the DID design. What I'm going to show you is primarily a TWFE, and then we assess the effect of the technology on that, if there is a credit uptake or not. Okay, so what are the key findings? What we find is that this was introduced in 2020 April, and it was a staggered implementation. Not every point has got the property card at the same point in time, and not every states also have got it. What we found that even within 1 or 2 time horizon, we find this particular scheme has improved volume of bank lending. Okay, that's again a very early signal. It may so happen that state what we have chosen is showing up this because one reason for that, the Madhya Pradesh where the things are showing up positive impact possibly is due to the Madhya Pradesh has far better digitized systems of land records, digitized systems of even foreclosures. Okay, I think this is where, and banks face much more comfortable even lending there. That's what we find. And I think just to quickly go to the literature, I do not want to talk about the literature per se, but you do find, starting from, I think, Klaus's early work in 2012 on India's digitization of land records itself in a particular state of Andhra Pradesh, where he found it actually improved a lot, the credit uptake. But that's, again, the setting was R1. Rural setting, I don't think I have seen any paper yet where we find giving rural legal rights leading to credit uptake. Okay, this is possibly one of the earliest thing and we find similar things happening for the US. We have seen similar thing happening for China. So there are lots of, I think, evidence that this is what, the credit effects we find. Land as a collateral, it works. Then you find there are other, other legal rights to land. Again, this, literature is so huge. I think, and Klaus has worked, I think, during last, 15, 20 years on this area a lot, so I am not going to talk about it in any way. I do not know how much land Klaus owns, but I can say that how much literature he owns on this field. Okay, so just to go to the data and challenges. So what we do, we use the website of the particular scheme, SVAMITVA website, and the website provides details of everything what they are doing. We scrape through the website and try to get the village level information from there. And then we try to map that with the bank data. And data we find, there are a lot of discrepancies. Sometimes you find that the village which is showing as if their cards are already distributed, and we find that particular village you do not find even the drones have flown over. Okay, so there are discrepancies. What we did, we went and checked with few villages in nearby state where we live, and we find that many places actually cards have come, not even distributed. We find in the website they are reported. Okay, those are again, after all, it's a government-led program. There is a lot of visibility for doing something which fetches vote. Okay, so then there are a lot of discrepancies we found. That's why we had to make field visits. The basic problem what we found is about the data mapping of the village with the data of the bank branch. The basic problem is not that bank branch data is not available. Bank branch data is reported to the central bank, and central bank does not disclose the details of the branch level deposits and credit. What it discloses a center level, which is sub-district. Center basically would mean merging of several villages, several revenue units on which data was made available publicly. So we had no access beyond that. And there also, there was a rider. Reserve Bank of India, the Central Bank of India, does not provide anything, a center which has only less than 3 branches. So it's, in order to, nobody should be able to identify which branch has how much deposits and credit. It merges 3 branch minimum, so only that much was made available. So if I get only 3 branch data and above, then we may miss most of the rural sector, You do not get it. So what we did, we reached out to the Reserve Bank of India. Then, this is from the center level data what Reserve Bank discloses. We had to do some more jugglery and to create synthetic centers. Synthetic center means we said Reserve Bank of India, okay, you are giving central level information, but for us the entire data is important. What you do, you can map those center with bank branches. That information Reserve Bank discloses in their bank branch data. We use that and told Reserve Bank of India, or request Reserve Bank of India, I'll come very quickly, and convince them that this is important, went to governor and with all other connections. Finally, they could merge them. Basically, the aggregation becomes much at a higher level, which created bias for us. But finally, we got the data. And those synthetic branches we could use, and then we had the data for these things. So it's key parameters from what you can get it here. Villages notified for, these are the states on the left-hand side. And then survey done. You can make out maps transferred, inquiry completed, and then finally the property cards issued. Okay, and then in terms of branches, what you can see, there are characteristics of the branches. What you can find, the number of branches. It's a quarterly data starting from quarter of 2016. 4 years ahead, we are tracking the data quarterly from 2016 to 24 January. That's the data what we have. Using that data, And again, some of the, I think, basic characteristics, you can see how this has changed over a period of time. You can clearly make out that this is a staggered implementation of the program itself. Number of villages are getting included over a period of time. Centers are also getting covered over a period of time. Based on that, what we have is a very simple framework of the 2A fixed FX model. What we have is the left-hand side, our outcome variable, which is the credit and deposit in a center at time point t. On the right-hand side, the specification is very similar to that of, I think, Klaus and Goel's 2012 JDE paper, but this is not the specification we'd like to, but at present, because of the data limitation, this is what we're going to do, is then what we have share of villages in a particular center where property cards have been, work of the property card distribution has been completed. We also have branch information that we have put together. We also put the interest rate data, because interest rate is a key driver for credit, we know. So based on that, what we get is the following results. These results are, you can see the treatment for all villages put together of the 4 states, and 4 states together are all. And for the particular state MP, when I'm talking about Madhya Pradesh, you can see the credit impact is positive. And even if you take the treatment and lending rate, the marginals, you do find credit impact is positive, and it runs for some time as long as your effect of the lending rate is increasing, then you find it starts falling. I think, and there is, this is the main regression result so far what we have. We also show some kind of placebo. Placebo means the villages where the notification has happened, but they have not received the treatment. They have not got the cards yet. You do find that it has not shown up in any results. So the overall results, it shows, if you plot the overall all 6 states together, you do not find this the positive effect or significant effect, but you do find significant positive effect for the state of Madhya Pradesh, which is again, you can see that if you plot over a lending rate, as lending rate increases, you find it is going to decline. That also shows, the financial intermediation works quite well. And in conclusion, I think this is, again, I'm saying, very early indications of what we find on a pan-India experiment. The plan is this result, even this data is not helping us much going to the next step. Next step is we are going to get the branch level information. So, okay, no aggregation anymore. We are on the job, maybe another month of time. With that, we should be able to come back with a much greater results using maybe a staggered DID. And also we have a plan to take it to understand the spillover effect. Possibly there is a primary survey in downstream. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot, Abhimam. Very encouraging results for a very large program. So it's good to see it. Maybe let me open the floor for any questions. Just from my side, just a clarification. So you show results much more significant in MP.
Yes.
It's because what's the reason? Sort of
I think maybe Klaus can supplement me. We are making some guess because MP is one state where it has been implemented with greater, I think, and then the MP has a state which has far greater digitized system of land records. That also, the foreclosures are much easier there. These are the things possibly is helping. Yeah.
Oh, and let me just complement. I think the key reason we think is that MP has a digital registry of charges, where that is digitally linked to the banks, so the banks can immediately access every document and put a charge on the document. And that's why, I mean, whereas in all the other states, it's still a paper process. So if you want to get a loan, the bank needs to take your physical document. And of course, I think India has this practice of what they call equitable mortgage, which is a complete misnomer, which means that they take your title document as if that couldn't be forged and deposit it in the bank. And they even have a registry of equitable mortgages, which I think is even worse. I think Nicholas would. So I think the key thing that we think explains that, and that is where is the existence of an electronic charge registry in MP, but not in other states.
Okay, I think this is very, very interesting, and we're finishing right on time. I think with some help from Liquids outside, we probably will have more questions and interesting discussions. Let me take the opportunity really to thank our 4 presenters, Marco, Justin, Gharad, and Abhiman, for really interesting insightful papers this afternoon. Thank you very much.